What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. So I finally decided to skip out on the semi-nomadic virtual therapy life, and I signed a lease for an office. Yes, after almost 2.5 years of being exclusively virtual, I'm opening my practice for in-person therapy. I know, I can't even believe it. And we all know that during the pandemic, pretty much every therapist switched over to virtual therapy, even if they had been doing exclusively in-person services up till then. And despite the devastating reason for why we needed to all go virtual, for some folks, they felt like, oh, this is kind of nice. I'm into this virtual therapy thing. Nonetheless, I signed a lease for a pretty penny for this beautiful office space. Now, it's currently very much in progress. I mean, the couch alone is on 3 months back order, so I'll be sure to give you a full tour once it's all set up. But for now, I thought I would share a little bit about the pros and cons of having a virtual versus in-person office, and also name a few reasons why I opted to offer in-person therapy myself. So let's hop into it. One of the pros of virtual therapy is that it's super convenient for you as the therapist. I mean, as I said before, you can skip out on the commute, wear your comfy yoga pants while you're working, and you can work from the comfort of your own home. I mean, those are some really wonderful advantages to virtual therapy from home. So we might say on the flip side, for in-person therapy, you gotta commute to work usually, unless you're doing it from home. You probably are not gonna be wearing pajama bottoms for in-person therapy. I mean, if you do, more power to you. That's pretty sweet. And you miss out on all those little home comforts, like maybe just popping over to the kitchen and grabbing a snack, or playing fetch outside with your dog for 10 minutes between sessions. You don't have access to those types of things when you're doing in-person therapy. Now, another pro of virtual therapy is it's very affordable. I mean, without the overhead cost of paying rent for an office, the overhead costs for running even a full-time virtual therapy business from home are so low. Compared to almost any other business, it's super affordable to pay your overhead costs. And of course, on the flip side, for in-person therapy, again, unless you're offering in-person therapy from your home, you're probably paying rent for an office, and for many of us, that is gonna be our biggest overhead expense, and it can get pretty expensive. Another pro of virtual therapy is easy on-ramp into private practice. I mean, if you're starting from no business and you want to launch your practice and you want to do it virtually from home, it's super accessible. Like, you don't have to go buy a bunch of stuff. You don't have to buy a bunch of furniture, rent an office. You can just kind of start. I mean, there are a few things you do need to do, but it's relatively doable in a short period of time. It's quite accessible. So of course, that's a con for in-person therapy. There are a few more steps that you need to take. Of course, going and signing a lease, but there's just additional layers, like on your liability insurance, you need to add slip and fall. Like, there's just these little details. It's just a little bit more work to get set up above and beyond the expense of signing a lease. And another pro of virtual therapy is it's very convenient for our clients. I mean, there are so many folks who are now able to meet with me in the middle of their workday who otherwise weren't able to schedule a time to meet in the middle of the day. So it's created accessibility for our clients. Maybe more folks can access counseling who couldn't have before, or not as easily. And then of course, on the flip side, for in-person therapy, it just creates another hassle, let's say, for clients to have to come see you from wherever they are. They have to schedule it in and drive over or get access to come over. That's not always easy to do. Now, another advantage of virtual therapy that is worth mentioning is the physical protection that it offers. Obviously, of relevance lately is the physical protection of viruses that we're all looking for, whether from therapist to client or vice versa, or the waiting room or wherever else it could happen. There's also the very real concern of actual physical safety, whether you work with clients who tend towards acting out through physical violence or who maybe have a tendency towards stalking behavior, both of which I've experienced at points along the way in my past. Well, virtual therapy spares you from those things. Your clients potentially don't know where you're located at any point in time, which is a wonderful gift of sense of safety for those of us who've had our safety threatened. And of course, on the flip side, with in-person therapy, it creates opportunities for whatever sort of physical dangers can happen to take place. So far, we've talked about things that are pros of virtual therapy and probably more cons of in-person therapy, but let's flip it and talk more about some of the cons of virtual therapy. In my view, one of the biggest cons is that virtual therapy lacks that sense of warmth that comes with in-person therapy. Now, my understanding of what we do as therapists generally is that it's a combination of science and art. Now, the science piece obviously is there. We are using evidence-based treatments that have been tried and tested. We know that they work. But there's also this art component where it's not just kind of a robotic just implementation of these science pieces. There's an artistic component, which I think leverages the majority of our senses, and also this kind of like sixth sense of something that happens in person where we're just like, I'm not sure why, but I'm sniffing something out. And when we're meeting virtually, we only have our senses of hearing and sight to go off of, and we're missing all those other senses that we have at play when we're meeting in person, which can make it a little bit more challenging and offer the potential for us to miss things, let alone also the fact that sometimes we don't hear everything that somebody says, or, the screen gets laggy so we don't see it super clearly either because of poor connection and things like that. So even those senses get a little bit hindered as well. On the flip side, in-person therapy, and this is just sharing my own personal experience, and I don't know if everyone feels this way, but I just feel like it's so much easier for me to know what to do next with a client when I'm meeting in person. It's happening in a part of my brain that feels like it's on autopilot. And when I'm doing virtual therapy, I am just very actively thinking in the front of my brain, trying to solve a puzzle, trying to put things together. I think I'm having to leverage more of the science side of my brain because I have less access to the data that sort of feeds the artistic side of my brain, if that makes sense. Another con of virtual therapy is tech glitches, because even when you and your client have the best of internet setup and the best of audio and the best of everything, tech glitches happen, and that disrupts counseling, obviously. On the flip side, on the in-person side of things, the kind of disruptions that happen tend to be more minimal, or it's, whatever's local to your area. I have had that happen. For example, I had to stop scheduling a client in a certain hour on Fridays because that was when the leaf blower came through and they were leaf blowing right by the window, so I just stopped putting sessions during that hour. But the technology kind of disruption, I think, just irks me in a different way, and some of those things can be controlled for in person a little more. Another con of virtual therapy is the inability to ensure confidentiality to the same degree that you can control for in person. This came up a lot during the beginning of the pandemic especially, but it still comes up where folks try to schedule in the most confidential space with their therapist, but it might be like, Doc, I'm not really comfortable talking about that today because I'm not sure if so-and-so on the other side of the door can overhear me a little bit. And when you're seeing your client in person, you just have more control over some of the variables related to confidentiality, all the way down to what kind of office space you're working in. For example, I'm now in an office space with exclusively fellow therapists. The walls have extra soundproofing. There are 2 locked doors between me and the parking lot. So there's just a lot of variables protecting confidentiality. And another potential con of virtual therapy is that it can potentially offer less safety in crisis scenarios. So if there is a moment where your client, as you're working with them, is in immediate danger, there's less control that you have as the therapist to help them, to protect them. In contrast, when you meet in person, there's just a little bit more control over these crisis scenarios. It takes a little bit more than just pushing a button for your client to exit the session, for example. You can keep them there with you live if you need to talk them through something, or you need them to stay with you, maybe while you're calling an ambulance or a loved one to come help them, whatever the case may be given the crisis scenario. Another item worth mentioning that could be kind of both a pro and a con of virtual therapy is that it has its own unique set of advantages and disadvantages when it comes to seeing multiple people as your client. So if you work with couples or if you do group counseling, an advantage of virtual therapy is it can be a lot easier to coordinate everyone to show up if you meet virtually versus in person. Maybe not everyone even lives in the same city, for example. Maybe it's just harder to get to that place for different reasons. But a con is also that the more people you have in the room and virtual therapy, just the more opportunity there is for tech glitches, and if there's a lag and it seems like people are interrupting each other, but actually it was technology, and it's just a little bit harder to get a sense of everything that's happening in the room because it's a little bit more like segmented in this virtual therapy context. On the flip side, for in-person therapy, of course, there's the benefit of like you're all here together and you can kind of deal with things live a little bit more on point, I feel like. But it has the con of like now you have to coordinate everyone showing up at the same place. And again, maybe not even everyone lives in the same place. So that's its own unique challenge. So after I went through this whole list, I'm aware that if you just counted number of pros for virtual therapy versus number of pros for in-person therapy, the list is longer as far as benefits of virtual therapy. And yet, I already told you I've opted to sign a lease and offer in-person therapy for my clients. So what's that about? Well, for me, one of the cons of virtual therapy that didn't exist with the in-person therapy was just so significant that it completely tipped the scales for me. And that was the piece that I talked about how when you're meeting virtually, you don't have full access to all of your senses as you engage with your client, and some of that part of the therapy work that we do diminishes. So for me, with all of that said, even though it's expensive, I have to drive in my car to go to my office versus work from home, and I choose to put on something nicer, at least on my bottom half than I would if I were at home, it's all still completely worth it to me. And for my clients who either prefer to meet virtually or who live too far away maybe to actually come in to see me in person, I still have the option for virtual therapy as well. And before we close, I'd like to thank TherapyNotes.com for sponsoring this video. Once upon a time, I had a fully paper charting system, and so when I was meeting with my clients in person, I definitely had to finish all of my notes while I was still in the office, and some days that just wasn't totally convenient for me. So now it's really lovely to be able to toggle whether I'm doing my notes from home or in the office, because TherapyNotes goes with me wherever I am. If you'd like to check out TherapyNotes, you can get 2 months to try it for free with no commitment just by clicking the link in the description of this video. Well, I hope you found this video helpful as you consider some of the pros and cons of whether you want to do virtual or in-person therapy. Let me know in the comments which of these works best for you in this season of life and why. I love to hear different people's perspectives and preferences. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.